Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the UK Workplace Happiness Report, key findings. So we'll get into the presentation now, and we'll go through just to give you a bit of an idea of how this is going to work. We've got a presentation which will probably take around 20 to 30 minutes to go through. There's an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. Feel free to put some questions into the chat as we go, and we'll cover those off either as we go or towards the end of the session. So my name's Tony Latter. I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEO of the Happiness Index. My role at the Happiness Index is I'm the managing director, but one of my other roles that I look at is I analyse a lot of the insights for our customers, but also for some of our partners and for the Global Workplace Happiness Report. So I've got over 10 years experience of analysing data and then converting that insight into actionable steps for organisations. I've written a number of white papers on the evolution of the employee experience, and I have that experience in translating cultural data into business growth. So what to expect in the next 30 minutes. So we're going to go through some of the headline details from the UK section of the Global Workplace Happiness Report. We'll go into a little bit of the neuroscience, and then we'll look at some of the high-level benchmarks in those headline reports. We'll go through a bit of the neuroscience results as well. We'll take a look at some of the question level results. We won't go through all of the questions, but there's some particular key areas that I'd like to highlight today for you. We'll go through some of the key findings and then into some of those kind of practical considerations. So off of the back of today's session, what could you go and do within your own organizations? And then there's a summary at the end, and then we'll do a little bit of a Q&A. So in terms of the headline details, so as I mentioned, all of the data that we're analysing today came from a Happiness Index survey that we ran for the Global Workplace Happiness Report. We collected data from the 1st of February 2025 all the way around to the 31st of January 2026. Within the UK, we had 24,000 people respond. Within the overall Global Workplace Happiness Report, that was around 85,000 that we had. We had over 500,000 questions answered from employees based in the UK. We looked at over 7,000 comments, and today we're going to go through some of the ratings, but also some of the insights from the comments as well. One of the things just to note here, these aren't our observations. This isn't the Happiness Index running focus groups around employees in the UK. This is the view of thousands of employees globally for the Global Workplace Happiness Report, and also those based in the UK. So today we'll give you a really clear picture of what the UK employees are thinking about their employee experience. As I mentioned, we're going to go into a little bit of the neuroscience. We're not going to go into this in any particular detail. I'm just going to give you the real headlines. And the reason for that is you'll hear kind of throughout the webinar, us just talking about some of the kind of terminology that we use at the Happiness Index. So when we look at the neuroscience, we think it's really, really important that for a thriving culture, you need to measure both what employees are thinking, but also what they are feeling as well. The way that we summarize that is we look at happiness as emotion, i.e. what are we feeling as individuals? That gives us our energy and our motivation. Then we look at engagement as being about purpose and clarity. So that's about speaking to our brain around what we think and gives us direction. Both of those are essential. You can't have one without the other. For example, if you have too much of the happiness side, the emotional side, you can create stagnation because you don't have the direction to move forward. Likewise, if you have too much of the engagement part, you have a huge amount of direction, but that can lead to burnout because you're not taking into account some of the other factors that are related to the happiness part of our model. You can see the model on the right-hand side here, where anything that's in yellow is linked into happiness. Anything that is pink is linked into engagement. It kind of flows through as you go down. So we'll look at some of the neuroscience themes around things like safety and freedom, relationships and acknowledgement. So that's terminology you'll hear throughout today. We'll also look at things like personal growth, meaning and purpose, clarity, and enablement. So we just wanted to share a little bit of that with you now, just so some of those terms that we see throughout the rest of the webinar are familiar and you can understand a little bit about where they all sit within our model. So Joe, one of my colleagues, is here on the webinar with me. So Joe, thanks for triggering that poll. What we'd really like to see is, just before we get started, a little bit of a poll around what are your biggest challenges. So Joe's going to open that poll up. But essentially what we're trying to establish is the challenge around capturing feedback? Is it about analysing feedback, taking action off of the feedback, or is it about the demonstrating the ROI that you're seeing? So we've asked this question a number of times over the years, and one of the key things that we've seen is it's evolved and changed. Often capturing feedback was going to be the challenge. Then it moved into how do we analyze it. Now what we're starting to see is, with C-suites and boardrooms starting to ask a little bit more around, okay, well, what's the return on the investment in a number of kind of people initiatives? That's where we're seeing that biggest change. So we'll keep the poll open just for a moment longer, but as we can see, most of the feedback coming into those top two, where the challenge is really either about taking action from the results or how we are then demonstrating the return on investment of all of the people initiatives that we're doing here. Okay, we're going to move on. Joe, if you could close that poll down. That was really helpful. So thank you for sharing there. And also what that will do is, as we're going through this presentation, you'll see there's a number of things that we can look at in terms of how do we link back into some of those key business outcomes. For example, retention, productivity, collaboration, those types of things. So we'll come on to that as we go through. First thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at some of these headline results. So we can see that we've got scores here for the UK, and we're comparing that against the global average as well. We have an overall score, which is the happiness index. We have the happiness side of our model, which we're measuring, which is in the middle there, and then the engagement side as well. We look at these three numbers and we kind of look at them as a UK pulse. So if there's kind of three headline metrics that we're going to pick out, these would be the three that we look at. A score for the happiness index of 7.6 for the UK versus 7.3 is a really good baseline. It's outperforming that global average. When we see a score of roughly probably 7.5 or above, that is a strong culture. Not quite thriving, but definitely strong. The way that we have described the overall global score of 7.3 is that it is stable. So the UK is ahead of the global average there. When it comes to looking at happiness, there's a slightly bigger gap there. It's 7.7 for the UK versus 7.3 globally. And then for engagement, again, outperforming that global average of 7.3 with a score of 7.6. These headline numbers are really good at, as I say, giving us that headline. However, we really want to try and understand the why behind some of these numbers, and that's what we'll go on to next. So just looking at some of the neuroscience results, we talked earlier about the neuroscience model, and within that model, we talked about themes such as safety, freedom, etc. So that's why we wanted to give you a little bit of the neuroscience earlier on. These 8 themes are essentially the fundamental building blocks of the employee experience. They move beyond just the basic levels of satisfaction to measure that deep-rooted emotional and psychological kind of drivers of workplace culture. What we can see when we analyze here is that if we look at relationships, they score 8.3 and clarity 7.9. They're the highest scoring themes within the survey. What it shows is that employees have really strong relationships. There's really good team dynamics, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Strong, energetic connections. However, when it comes into looking at things like acknowledgement and personal growth, these are some of the lowest scoring areas that we see. When we look just as an overall headline, the UK outperforms every single global benchmark around these neuroscience results. So really, really key areas for us are relationships and clarity on the positive side. And then we're looking at acknowledgement and personal growth as areas that could be improved. What we look at is these output questions. So these output questions are really kind of key for us as looking as areas that the business can improve on, but also looking at things as business outcomes. So one of the key things around the happiness index survey, yes, we measure the employee experience, but we also measure some of these business outcomes such as ENPS, productivity, pay and benefits, intention to stay. These are really, really good questions that we can run key driver analysis against that allow us to then start linking some of the cultural elements that we're measuring back into business outcomes. And when we're looking at how do we demonstrate ROI back into the business, analyzing against these business outcomes is a really, really positive way of doing that. And we've seen a number of our customers be able to demonstrate how by improving, for example, collaboration has had a direct impact on driving productivity within the business. So a really nice way of linking back into some of those business outcomes. So as we can see here, the UK ENPS is a score of +8, which is higher than the global baseline, which is +1. UK employees also reported slightly higher levels of productivity. So it was a 7.6 versus a 7.5 for the global. You've got pay and benefits as a 6.5. So again, outperforming in a number of different regions. But what we can see is it's slightly it's level with the global average, which is also 6.5 there. The intention stays a really interesting one. So we looked at the UK versus global, and we measure intention to stay by looking at things such as, are you likely to be in this role in 12 months' time? And then based upon how they score, we group them into one of three areas, either likely to leave, passive, i.e. they could leave, they could stay, or they are likely to stay. So when we analysed it against the kind of the global benchmarks, the thing that really stood out is globally, 72% of staff said that they are likely to remain within their role in the next 12 months. But when we looked at the UK, that was only 62%. So there's a deficit there that represents a risk to UK organisations. What we're going to look at through the rest of this presentation is some of those cultural levers that organisations can pull that can start to improve that situation. So when we look at the results here, so on the left-hand side, you see a table, and in that table are all of the questions that are asked that are linked back into our neuroscience themes. There's 24 of them. We're not going to go through all of them in any detail. You'll see the slides which are available to download. You'll probably see a button that will pop up at the bottom. If not, we'll get those sent out to you. So you can look at them in a little bit more time and a little bit more detail yourselves. But really what we're going to try to highlight here is that in 19 out of the 24 questions that are linked back into our neuroscience themes, 19 of those are higher in the UK. The UK scores really, really well for things like relationships. So when we dig down into relationships, we're looking at things like energetic connections. So the UK score is up 9.1% on the global score. When we're looking at things like team dynamics, it's up 6.4%. So strong areas for the UK there. But there are absolutely some areas of concern. So when we look at things like collaboration, that is down 14.3% on the global average. And also the frequency of feedback is down again, just under 11% there. So these are some really critical areas for the employee experience. But what we're seeing is the relationships that employees have are really strong, is creating a safe and enjoyable place to work. But there are some real challenges. Working in silo is something we saw a lot of within the questions and the comments coming through. That is starting to push employees out. So when we look at things like intention to stay, we know how important things like belonging are. We know how important things like collaboration are, but they don't score particularly highly. So we're going to look at some of the key findings. And within these key findings, what we wanted to do is just pick out some nuggets. So if you're going to go back to your colleagues and they'll ask you, oh, what was that webinar like? Hopefully some of these key findings will just be those sound bites that you're looking for that you can just relay back in. First area that we looked at was trying to identify whether there are some big gaps, either positively or negatively. And the biggest gaps that we saw were around some of the belonging, feedback, collaboration areas. We wanted to isolate those three and really kind of drill down in those because they're the areas that we saw that UK organisations were struggling with. So as we saw earlier, 62% of UK employees said they were likely to be in their role within 12 months. All of those are directly linked into belonging, feedback, and collaboration. So when people don't have the opportunity to collaborate, when they don't feel they've got that guidance or that level of feedback coming into them, and that doesn't need to be formal feedback, that can be more informal feedback around projects or weekly one-to-ones, whatever mechanism that may be. If they don't have that, if they don't feel like they belong in an organization, that will directly impact their connection to that organization. That connection is what will either mean people stay or they leave. These, we didn't see these as failures within the UK organisations and the UK business world. We saw these as areas of opportunity, areas where we can improve. The UK has a strong baseline, 7.6, as we saw earlier on. By improving these areas, we can increase that further as well. We've talked a lot about collaboration, but one of the things that we really wanted from this webinar was to give you kind of the ammunition to go back into your organization, talk about why these things are important, but not only why they're important because of a score, but also their impact. So when we looked at the impact of collaboration, we ran a key driver analysis. It ranked all of the neuroscience themes, the 24 themes that are within our model. The top three that are linked into productivity are team dynamics, which we know the UK scores strongly on, collaboration, which we know the UK can improve, and then energetic connections. These are things that are really, really important to driving productivity around a business. And some of those things, the UK as a whole are doing well and some isn't. We know that when we're looking at collaboration, it's not a motivation issue. Things like team dynamics and wanting to work with your team score really well. The energetic connections from employees scores really well. There doesn't seem to be a reluctance from individuals to work with their colleagues and be within those team dynamics, but we do see it being an enablement issue. And where these silos persist, it's a real barrier to collaboration. Again, looking at the importance of the key driver analysis and in particular belonging. So belonging is a really critical part of the UK employee experience. It's the single highest driver across overall happiness, engagement, intention to stay. That tells us how important it is. And despite that really strong influence, in the UK, belonging scores just a 6.5. So one of the key things that organizations need to be thinking about is how do we ensure our people are having that sense of belonging? How do we make sure that to protect our talent, to make sure that we are retaining our best people, belonging is a key area that we need to focus in on. Now we're going to look at what organizations are tending to invest in versus what actually is really, really important. So we know that the areas that have the largest impact on productivity at work aren't operational. They are more about relationships, the connections, collaboration, as we saw, belonging, really, really important, but they're not operational. And what we tend to find is when we go and speak with organizations, when we go and speak at events, the key thing that organizations are tending to invest in are more of the operational, tending to invest in things that can be managed, that we can understand, that we can measure. For example, that may be around communication and clarity of that communication. It could be around workload management, doing workload audits, etc. Now, we're not saying those things aren't important. However, what we can see is if you look at the two red boxes towards the bottom of the screen, that is, first of all, the clarity on your requirement, and then right towards the bottom is the ability to manage your workload. Both of those have a relatively low impact on productivity, whereas the things we know that are having that biggest impact are things like the team dynamics, being able to collaborate. These are really key areas. So what we're highlighting is there's a mismatch between what organizations are investing in compared to those things that are having the biggest impact on driving productivity. Then when we get into some of the other areas that we've looked at, for example, acknowledgement and personal growth are two key areas within our neuroscience model, but they are the lowest scoring themes. And although they are the lowest scoring themes, they are hugely important in terms of things like intention to stay and advocacy. Our measure of advocacy is we look at things like ENPS. So that's a really, really good way of understanding how many of your employees are likely to be advocates and actively promote the organization. What we can see here is 4 out of the top 10 drivers of retention are linked into personal growth and acknowledgement. And again, for advocacy, 4 out of the top 10 drivers are linked into those areas as well. What this tells us is those areas are significantly important for retention and advocacy. However, there's work to be done because we know there are areas that organizations don't score particularly high in. Another area that we wanted to look at that kind of really drew our attention in the UK was there are a number of different filters that we had within the Global Workplace Happiness Report. And specifically looking at the UK, what we found was that scores tended to decrease as seniority decreased as well. So what we found was executive leaders, those that are in the more senior positions, so for example, C-suite CEO, scored 8.4, which was the highest within the UK. What we then saw was that the lowest scoring were entry-level staff. So these are often the types of roles that are absorbing and coming up against those collaboration barriers. They're the types of roles that we're seeing are feeling more and more disconnected in the UK to their organisation. Comment analysis showed us that they're feeling isolated, they're feeling disconnected from the business, feeling locked out of career progression. What was interesting as well was within the UK, the results were quite different from the global report. In the global report, what we saw was more of the middle manager level. So looking at that operational management scoring the highest. And within the global report, the reasons for that is because they had the ability to see the direct impact of the initiatives they were putting in place. They could see the success stories for themselves within the individuals that they manage. Whereas within the exec leadership, there was a bit more of a gap to that, maybe not necessarily seeing all of those organizational impacts, those successes coming through on a daily basis. That might be reported in financial numbers, for example, and not hearing the personal stories that sit behind. So quite a key difference between the UK and the global scores that we had. We also wanted to highlight the differences between how males and females scored. So females outscored male respondents across the majority of our survey. So when we're looking at the 24 neuroscience themes, out of those 24, 18 females scored higher than males. They tied in the other 6. So actually there wasn't an area where males scored higher than females. When we look at the levels of response, actually it was fairly evenly split between males and females. There wasn't a huge amount of difference. It was slightly higher for males, roughly about 53% versus 47% for females. So really good representation and sizes there. The gaps are quite small. So when you get the size, please do, if this is an area that interests you, go and have a look at the individual results. They are quite small, and on their own individually, they don't really mean anything. However, the fact that 18 out of 24 were different, and in the other 6 they tied, that to us was quite meaningful. When we started to dig down a little bit deeper, what we found was that there were particular areas where females scored more strongly than males, and the gaps were a little bit bigger, and that would be around things such as safety, acknowledgement, and meaning and purpose. So what we're going to jump into now is we've gone through the key insights. There's a button there if you wanted to download a copy of the Global Workplace Happiness Report. But we didn't just want to deliver the insights back. What we wanted to try and do is give you some of these practical tips that you could think about whilst you're looking at your own organizations. And although you may not have the data to go alongside that, you may see certain things that we've talked about here being challenges for you within your organizations, whether that be around belonging, whether that be about organizational values or collaboration, etc. So we're just going to highlight 4 key areas that came through within the results and within the comments. So the first one was around addressing a belonging deficit. So that is trying to look at how do we start to prioritize initiatives that are going to create a deeper sense of connections for individuals. If we can create that deeper sense of connection, we can then look at how we can impact their sense of belonging. This particular initiative has been chosen because we know how important it is to have a really strong sense of belonging. However, it's one of the weakest areas for the UK, scoring just a 6.5. So some of the things that organizations we speak to and some of the recommendations we make, some of the things that they look at is trying to introduce some of this more regular, non-transactional check-ins, where actually you're interested in the employee, treating them as a valued individual, making them feel heard and listened to, rather than a resource that can be deployed. We'll come on to that within the summary because there's some interesting connections there with what we saw in the Global Workplace Happiness Report. Then we start thinking about how do we live the organizational values? So aligning the organization's values with the daily lived experience of employees. The reason why we chose this was the comment analysis in particular showed that there were lots of comments around organizations not living the values that are being promoted. So yes, they're being promoted, yet they're not necessarily being felt on the ground. Lots of the comments that we saw and a growing trend that we have seen around the UK is cost-cutting exercises, whether that be redundancies or removing certain resources from organizations. That plus unmanageable workloads are having a really big impact and contradicting some of those values. Now, we're not saying organizations shouldn't be doing some of those things, because for the organizations, they may be the right things to be doing. However, there is a way in which those things can be done, a way in which organizations can do those, but also allay some of the concerns that employees have. Some of the things that we look to deliver around that could be making sure those organizational values are being lived from the boardroom right the way down the organization. Can that be linked into management KPIs? Can that be linked into some of the cultural metrics that you have around the organization as well? How do organizations take these values and make sure they're being lived? They're being experienced by people within the conversations that they're having. They're not something that people see on a wall or maybe in an all company meeting. They're things that are directly having an impact just in the day-to-day conversations that people are having. That's how we can start to move some of those values and bring them into that lived experience. So just moving on into the second set of considerations, as we saw, collaboration was a massive part of the results from the UK. Removing those silos, streamlining the workflows are going to be really, really important to boosting enablement within organizations. So the key reason why we chose this is we know that the UK's performance is lower than the global average. So it's a 6 for the UK versus a 7 for the global score. The comment analysis showed that there's a lot of communication silos within organizations which are creating frictions, kind of reducing some of that productivity. What we saw a lot of was people talking about productivity being quite strong within their part of the business, whether that be their team, their department, their location, but not necessarily particularly strong across the wider organization. That is directly impacting the productivity of the business. So some of the ways that organizations have been looking at changing is to try and move away from some of the rigid structures, adopting more of a cross-functional way of working. That doesn't mean that structure isn't required and that we should all rip up our organizational charts. What that does mean, though, is there an ability to draft someone in from a different area of the business to work on a project? rather than it being seen as a IT project? Could it be seen as a project that is then run by a squad, not just the IT team? Could you involve people from different areas of the business to give a different level of insight that could create a far stronger outcome? Another area that we saw was around trying to streamline communications. So lots of individuals talked about multiple communication channels within their organizations, linking back into things like WhatsApp groups or intranets or chat, Teams, was it through emails, particular workflows that mean that you have to use particular systems. What we found is that was quite overwhelming for a lot of individuals. So what they were looking for is a way of trying to streamline, trying to remove kind of barriers to productivity where you're trying to find a piece of communication from a team member, from a manager. Was that sent to me on WhatsApp, chat, Teams, wherever it may be? Was it on an email? And people are going and searching. Just reducing some of those barriers, streamlining the communications can have a really, really big impact. Then the final consideration that we're going to look at is around rebalancing the feedback loop. What we saw was lots of individuals feeling as if the level of feedback frequency wasn't particularly strong. That was a key pain point in the UK, scoring almost 11% lower than the global average. A 5.7 out of 10 was one of the lowest scoring questions that we saw within the survey. Things that tended to come up were things like, I get feedback once a year, kind of the annual appraisal. What we need to try and work on as organizations is how can we encourage managers to actively give feedback so it doesn't feel like it is transactional, but that it is more of a supportive coaching way of leadership and management. That would be really, really key to trying to boost feedback, but also that has a massive impact on a number of different things. People feeling that connection with their employer, people feeling as if they belong in that organization, creating a higher level of trust between the employee and their manager and the organization as well. All of those things would have a direct improvement on some of the lower scoring areas that we saw within the survey. So today we've gone through the UK insights. What we have within the Global Workplace Happiness Report is an area that is all around country snapshots. So there are 17 countries that met our thresholds to mean that they could be included within the Global Workplace Happiness Report and have their own section. Each of those sections looks at benchmarking against a global score, a particular peer group that were based either on geography, economy, labour markets, etc. These snapshots look at the overall happiness score, happiness engagement, neuroscience themes, EMPS, and productivity. So if you're in an organization that is multinational and you're interested in hearing a little bit more about some of the other countries, please, by all means, download a copy of the report. The link is there. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more, absolutely, please get in contact with us and we'd love to talk you through some of the other insights that we've seen as well. So just in summary, what we're going to look at now is some of the key things that we found within the Global Workplace Happiness Report, but also what we saw here in the UK. The number one finding that we found was that people experience work as a relationship. The UK report echoes this as well. So when we think about the relationships, we're talking here about that connection, that sense of belonging, the team dynamics. They're the types of things that people were looking at when they were responding and provided their feedback to us. The themes that predict happiness, advocacy, and retention are all about how we see ourselves as an individual within the relationship we have with our organization. Do I belong here? Does my organization inspire me? Am I valued? Do I feel listened to? These are all things that impact our connection. As with any important relationship that we have within our lives, they amplify or diminish our levels of energy. Just for a second, let's step out of the world of work and start thinking about our own relationships that we have. That may be with our families, with our partners, with our friends. When those relationships are strong and thriving, that provides us with energy. When they can become a little bit more challenging, that's something that has a negative impact on our energy. Work is absolutely no exception to that. The levels of commitment, the overall well-being, they are all amplified by being in strong relationships. Where we see some of the tensions is between traditionally organizations have focused their resources on what people need to thrive, and being around workload, communications, more of the operational side, because on the operational side, we can tend to measure that. We can tend to have a process in place. We can tend to have a system that can help us with the operational side. Those things don't exist in the same way when we're starting to think about more of the relationships, the connections that people have. What we saw in the Global Workplace Happiness Report was individuals want to have that level of connection with their organization. However, historically, organizations have seen the employer and employee relationship as being transactional. The organization will give a salary, give benefits, give time off in return for the skills, the experience, and the knowledge of the individual. That's very transactional. So the key takeaway from the Global Workplace Happiness Report, but also the UK section of it, is that needs to change. Organizations need to see the employer and employee relationship as being that a relationship, building on that connection. It's not a transaction, it's a relationship. Now, the final thing that I'll just mention here is culture is never perfect. So if you're looking at this thinking we're scoring really well in some of those key areas, that's brilliant. But it doesn't mean that the culture box is ticked. It's not a destination. It's always about that ongoing commitment to measuring, understanding what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what can we build on, how can we work on them, whether they're our strengths so that we can get better, whether they're our weaknesses so we can improve. All of those are really, really important. So it's a cultural journey that organizations go on, that employees go on, that is being led by you guys on the call. So that's the key point within the Global Workplace Happiness Report, that relationship element. If you wanted to look at booking in a consultation with us, we will happily do that. We'll have a conversation with you. It's not a sales call. It's just how can we help you? How can we share the results? Are there some key insights that we have that could potentially help your organizations? You can benchmark against your organizations as well. How are your organizations performing globally? You can go to our website, take a survey from there. You can share that with a number, I think it's up to 250 people within your organization. So again, you can start to get a bit of an understanding of where you sit against these results, and you can use the QR code that we've got there. We have a little bit of time now just to run through some questions. Joe was keeping an eye on the chat for us as we were going through. So I don't know, Joe, if we've got any particular questions that came through from the chat, or whether there's any questions that anybody would like to raise. We've got a few moments now just to cover off some of those. Okay, so I can see the first question there. Are the entry-level results linked to change in expectations? It's difficult. In general, no. Within certain individuals, there may be certain expectations that they have that are maybe a little bit more ahead of maybe where the individual is. But those results for the entry-level people, some of the things that we saw, and although this wasn't covered within the slides, I'll mention it now, is for those entry-level roles, another key area was the working style. So depending on your working style also had a bit of an impact on your employee experience. For example, those that we saw that had hybrid roles have tended to score really well because they have that blend and that mix of having the flexibility, for example, to work from home or from a different location, and also have the expectation of being able to learn from their colleagues, being able to pick up on maybe how a colleague dealt with a difficult customer call, or there's a particular challenge that somebody had and they could ask people for some support. So there are other areas which impact that. It's difficult to say kind of on a more granular level whether there are people coming into the workforce at entry-level jobs that have more of a kind of change in expectation. But what we did see is those entry level results were being blocked by some key things. I don't think, like, there are changing expectations maybe, but not necessarily in some of the real fundamentals and basics. When we looked at areas that in particular those entry levels people were struggling with were really around a sense of connection, a bit around belonging. Yes, there may be some changing expectations around progression and maybe people feeling like they're ready to progress maybe sooner than they are. Where that's really key is, how do we then help people and put them into a position where they can demonstrate that they are ready for a promotion or they are ready to take on more responsibility. What we've seen since COVID is maybe some of those opportunities have reduced because of the way in which we're working, and maybe being more remote doesn't necessarily lend itself to people being able to demonstrate that they're ready for that next step. So a question from Ranjit. So do small organizations can look for the happiness index? Yeah, we work with a range of different organizations, ranging from size. I think the smallest one that we work with is kind of around 20 people. The largest we work with is like hundreds of thousands. So there's a real mixture. If you're a small organization and you're interested in the happiness index, you can go to our website, you can register on there. You're able to take that for free for up to 250 people. So again, that's something that I'd encourage you to go and take a look at. Okay, another question here. So yeah, how often should we collect feedback from employees? Really good question. I think that really depends on the organization and your culture. Have you got a feedback culture in place? Typically, what a program would look like that our customers run is they will run the happiness index, which is the survey that the Global Workplace Happiness Report was based on, either once or twice a year. The reason why they would do maybe twice a year is so they can see a level of improvement every 6 months. For a number of our organizations, that feels like that's too soon. The key will be, what is your capability to, number one, gather the feedback, analyze it, and report back to your employees. That's the number one factor when we're looking at frequency. Collecting feedback without going back to the organization and sharing the results can be really damaging. It looks like organizations are kind of hiding the results. Maybe people start to lose a bit of trust in the process. So you've got to make sure you've got the ability to analyze and feedback your results before you start asking more questions. So typically we would look at maybe once or twice a year for the big feedbacks, the global workplace happiness survey, which is the cultural assessment, which is the happiness index survey. One of the other things we see is people following up with pulse surveys. So if there's a particular area that you've scored that you might want to follow up on, we see that as being like an add-on, and that is quite a nice way that people use surveys. It's really based upon your organization and trying to juggle that kind of feedback fatigue that people might see. Okay. Well, we're coming up to just about 11:45 now, so we'll call it there. But number one, thank you very much for coming along today. Number two, thank you for the questions as well, making that feel interactive. Please do feel free to reach out to us at the Happiness Index. We're really interested in your organizations, how our research can help you, and really looking at how we can help organizations to improve their culture and helping them prove that link, as we spoke about earlier on. Linking that culture into performance is a massive area of change that we're seeing within the market, and we're there to try to help support organizations to do that. So thank you very much for joining today, and we hope to see you soon on another webinar soon. Take care. Bye-bye.